Hello and Assalamu alaikum. I welcome everyone to ThinkFest Conversations Pakistan, which is an inclusive forum for diverse ideas and opinions. Thank you, Yaqub Bangish, for making this happen. The topic today is fake news, and we are rightfully calling it a tricky terrain to navigate. In 2013, in the Global Risks Report of the World Economic Forum, digital disinformation was called the digital wildfires because it warned of its potential to lead to a failure of global governance. Today, engagement with fake news stories has increased exponentially all over the world, especially when it comes to political campaigns, social cultural issues, and most recently, COVID. The debate isn't easy. Studies have found that people have a very hard time distinguishing between accurate and fake headlines. For many governments and health agencies around the world during COVID, apart from dealing with the health emergency, dealing with COVID-related fake news was also a very big problem. We all know that this requires stakeholders' engagement at various levels, and most of them are not exactly on the same page. To discuss this extremely important topic of fake news, we have a panel of practitioners and scholars from all over the world. I'd like to introduce them. We have Sham with us today, who is a broadcast journalist and senior lecturer in journalism in the United Kingdom. Thank you, Ping, for joining us.
Hello.
We have Lauren Bridges, who is a researcher at the Annenberg School of Communication, University of Pennsylvania, and she has a special interest in social media regulation models. Then we have Asad Baig from Pakistan, who is the founder for Media Matters for Democracy. And it's a nonprofit which works to defend freedom of expression, media, internet, and communication in Pakistan. Thank you, Lauren, Asad, Ping, for joining us today on this very important conversation. Ping, I'll start with you. We need to be clear with so many overlapping terms going around and so many different words going around. What exactly and how exactly do we define fake news?
Actually, fake news, there's different people have different ideas. But I think generally speaking, we all agree that fake news is like a fabricated news based on false elements. Basically, you make up a story. Of course, Donald Trump has a different idea, which I will talk about it later. But before I go down to the origin of fake news, I have to ask a question to the audience. Yeah, so is fake news a new phenomenon? You can answer in your head, or you can just type. As a new phenomenon. If it's not, say how old? Is it started from Donald Trump, or 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, or 1,000 years? How old? I would say that the term is relatively new, but the concept actually can be very old. Yeah, let's say go back to 3,000 years ago. So in Egypt, so the pharaoh, probably the most famous pharaoh, Ramses II, not Ramses the Great. So he was fighting with the Hittite Empire in the modern day about the Syria border. So the battle was a draw, basically a stalemate. But what he reported back to Egypt was victorious, so he won the battle. Of course, back then, there was no TV crew follow him. There's no CNN follow 24 hours news. So basically what you learn in Egypt is whatever he said. So basically it's a fake news. It was a draw, but he claimed that he won the battle. So that fast forward to 1938. So in New York, the CBS radio drama is called The War of the Worlds. So it's like a radio drama, the equivalent of today, like a Netflix. Back then, people listen to radio. So in the middle of this radio drama, breaking news. Martians from Mars has landed in East Coast near Virginia. And then continued broadcast. And later on, another breaking news. The Martians started to kill people with laser gun. And then later on, another breaking news. So they sent the National Guard trying to defeat them, but failed. And then people start to panic. Some people ran out from the house, jumped on the car, tried to run away. And only towards the end of the radio drama, it says you were listening to CBS radio drama. But it's too late. Many people panic and then ran away. And the next day on the New York Times, New York Post, and the headline was a radio war, fake radio war, sent people into panic. So that's like I say, something is not say recently new, but of course, Donald Trump, he broadened the meaning of fake news. According to him, basically whatever news criticizing him or he doesn't like, he called it fake news, including CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, the BBC. Of course, on top of that, there are other concepts which is quite relevant, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, information war, strategic communications. The meaning, some of them like a overlapping, similar or different, that actually makes people very confusing because you don't know what is that, which one is fake news, which one is propaganda. But I think when we talk about fake news, we need to consider one important thing is the intent and purpose of fake news is important. Is it just for fun? Or is it any political agenda? Right? Who benefits from spreading this fake news? Or does it cause any harm to others? For example, if a news satire parody is intended to amuse rather than to deceive. For example, one of the most famous news website in the States called The Onion.
Yeah.
You can go to check out. So basically, it's like April Fool Days news on a daily basis. So this is for fun. In terms of any cause of harm, that I would say yes, both intangible and intangible. Tangible probably is like a physical harm, which is a lot of examples related to COVID-19, which we'll talk about later today. And the intangible, one of the most important, basically you discredit established news media. So that's the problem.
Yeah, that it's very important that you touched upon discrediting established news media, because my question to Lauren is that we all know that in 2016 the conversations around fake news, they acquired global prominence because of the US presidential elections, and they've never stopped since then. Do you think there is an eroding trust of people in established media institutions that is leading to for them to believe fake news so much?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I very much agree with what Ping has already laid out around the terms that we use to describe fake news. So I think the question actually has two parts. The first part, which is, was there a rise, or did the prominence of fake news follow the 2016 election? And then the second part is, has there been an erosion of trust in established media, leading people to believe fake news? So I'll address them in two parts. According to the first part, was there a rise in fake news following 2016? I think this is largely attributed to Donald Trump. So it's true there was a big spike in fake news coverage in the mainstream news media. If you look at simple Google trends of the term fake news, it started to rise around October 2016, reaching a peak in January 2017 when Donald Trump was inaugurated. So at the time, the legitimacy of the Trump win was being questioned, and also pundits were saying all types of things about what it meant that Trump got elected. The term was then popularized by Donald Trump, who even created the Fake News Awards and depicted which were about news outlets that he said were misrepresenting him or producing false reports about him. The winners were announced on the GOP, on the Republican Party website, and at the top of the list was a New York Times columnist and economist who's also won a Nobel Prize, Paul Krugman, for saying that markets will never recover from Trump. So he was the top of the list for the Fake News Awards, according to Trump, which really does bring back what Ping has already laid out, that fake news just ends up being something that you don't agree with. It becomes a vessel for political ends. And if you look at the trends before October, fake news was largely referring to satire and parody, like War of the Worlds or The Onion. And there was starting to be a little bit of interest around the growth of so-called fake news factories leading up to the election in the United States, and I'm sure in other countries as well, which were concerned with the spread of disinformation on social media platforms. So I think it's really important how we define what fake news is. If you define fake news as disinformation, disinformation campaigns, or misinformation, accidental spread of misinformation online, then it does have a much longer history. But when you track the recent discourse around fake news, it really did start to rise after the Trump election, after the 2016 election. And so that really makes me as a scholar stop and pause and think, okay, so what is different about this current moment? If disinformation has existed, forever, for a long time, 3,000 years, according to Ping, then it's not so much a speech issue or an issue with our information environment. It's more about amplification of the issue. and it matters how we define it. So there are important differences between misinformation and disinformation, conspiracy theory, hoax, and fake news. Fake news has, as I said, come to mean anything that you want it to be, but that's not what news is. News, by definition, is reporting on recent events. While there are different frames that the news media will apply to reporting, which will be implicit, which might have implicit or explicit biases, it is generally based upon agreed upon facts of an event that has occurred. Whereas fake news is an oxymoron. It actually works to undermine the legitimacy of the news media industry and journalistic practices. So instead, I prefer to use a term that I actually draw from a professor at Annenberg, who I'm also working with, so I'll make that clear. Her name is Kathleen Hall Jameson, and she wrote a book on the 2016 election, and she uses the term viral deception. And what she's trying to get at is the motivation behind these coordinated attacks. And it's specifically related to social media platforms and a coordinated disinformation campaign. So in the second part of your question, has there been an erosion of trust in established news media? I think absolutely. If we look back, there has been other times when the information environment has been flooded with disinformation and partisan reporting, though we have not yet experienced these kinds of practices that have been amplified by platforms and by computational actors such as bots. So I think because of that, we do really need to be careful about what terms and what part of the fake news media environment we're actually referring to. If it is these coordinated disinformation campaigns that have computational actors. And so I think we all should push back on the rhetoric of fake news, because I'm sure we'll get into the discussion, it is also being used to suppress free speech online. Yeah.
I think that's a very detailed, especially this word viral deception is something that I think really describes the way social media has amplified, the spread of fake news. So yes, that's important. Asad, you know that it's not an easy debate in Pakistan. We have been going through a lot recently, especially with regards to how, what Lauren mentioned, the freedom of expression and all those things. And now we also know that the government has launched a fake news buster. So do you think initiatives like this will work to combat fake news and the whole controversy around it, and will be able to satisfy all the stakeholders involved?
So the short answer is no. I think Ping and Lauren have very nicely deconstructed the term fake news with very relevant examples. So I'm sure I don't need to go into that debate. But a slightly longer answer now. So I think Ping gave a very good example. I'll give one example which is closer to home for us in India and Pakistan at least. So before that, in India, from 2016 to 2018, there have been about 31 people who have been lynched as a result of viral disinformation, which was rampant on WhatsApp, for instance, and other groups and so on, other platforms. I'm sorry. There was this book which was written in 1400s. I think 1414 or something. It's called Malefice Maleficum. And so this book was basically written in Germany. And the idea of this book was that it declared that there were men and women who were working for Satan and they were witches. And this book to date remains perhaps one of the most elaborate idea of how witches, men and women, mostly women, are working for Satan and they're working against humanity and so on. And interestingly, this book also had a papal bull, which is basically endorsement from the largest sort of, the largest stage in Christianity attached to it. And the papal bull was about how there are witches and there are sort of women and men who are working for Satan. So in a way, it very, very cleverly used that papal bull and basically elaborated a whole story of how men and women, mostly women, were witches. And as a result, it caused countless hundreds of women, mostly women in the Europe, who were burned at the stake. So just a very, very small example of how disinformation is A, not new, B, can be very actively used to incite violence for a particular group, for a particular minority, for a particular sect, for a particular religion, and the list goes on. Now, your question was, how can the government sort of act in that regard. Now, so the problem with the fake news buster, that account you're mentioning, by the way, for those who don't know, it's a government initiative which seeks to fact check some of the information or so-called misinformation in that. So the point number one is that it's not fact checking misinformation; it's fact checking only political statements by political opposition. Right, so it's a very narrow spectrum of sort of content that it's reacting to. So it's not targeting for, it's not reacting to incitement to violence against, let's say, the Shia community in Pakistan, or any other religious minority, or and other kind of whatever minority, sectarian minority or ethnic minority in Pakistan, which are being targeted, and there is a very deliberate attempt to spread disinformation which can target this. So there is no kind of space to cover that. Number two. Number three, the idea of government fact-checking is, frankly, at least to me, bizarre. Because you see, let's say if Trump thinks that CNN is fake news, quote unquote, then how can we empower Trump, or how can we expect Trump to come up with like a very unbiased and very objective idea of what really misinformation is? Will he be able to sort of create an unbiased opinion for CNN, for example? Obviously not. And same example we've seen in Pakistan and India and literally everywhere. So the idea, to answer your question, the idea of government's fact checking is frankly bizarre.
Yeah. I think Asad brought this really important issue about the idea of government fact-checking news and facts, because it's mostly political comments that they're checking and not issues that really matter to a lot of people. So Ping, this brings me to a question about the control of narratives, because if there's certain people controlling what should be said and what should not be said, and it's this whole conversation about our truth versus your truth, doesn't it become very tricky to navigate? And how do journalists deal with it? Because you've been in the profession, and it's not something easy to deal with when you have so much going against you.
Yeah, very true. Because like I was a journalism or news industry are in crisis now, because as I mentioned earlier, so we have now propaganda, we have misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and then so what is the real truth? What is the real fake? Yeah, this is very tricky. And so one term is we call it a post-truth politics, where I say truth is no longer relevant. So as one journalist says, like quote him, so if you don't know what is true, you can say whatever you want, and it's not a lie. So the post-truth politics is very problematic. And another term is called alternative fact, which is if some of you might remember during the Donald Trump inauguration in 2017, his ceremony basically is some historical, very, very few people compare Obama. But he claims that he has the largest audience in history. So his advisor, Kellyanne Conway, was asked by the journalist, so how could you say that? And she said a term that we were giving alternative facts. So the journalist laughed and then said, this is not alternative facts. It's not fact, it's a falsehood. That term, I said, yeah, stick with them, with the Donald Trump alternative facts. And also another, like I say, to cause us in crisis, because so in the US, in the UK also as well, so the media landscape, they're more like bipolarized, so liberal versus conservative. So if you are conservative, you would believe whatever Fox News or the Sun says. If you are liberal, you will trust CNN, you will trust the BBC, you will trust New York Times, and you don't trust the other side. And that's down to there's a what we call a confirmation bias. Yeah, we believe what we want to believe. For example, I don't like Trump, so I would tend to believe whatever news is negative towards Trump. For Trump supporters, they would believe whatever news is so bad about Trump, they will say that's fake news. That's down to because of the social media, because of algorithms, they create filter bubbles. Because of algorithms, they keep feeding you the news that you've been reading, similar news. And eventually you're trapped in your echo chamber. You see what you want to see. So on my Facebook feed, those feed are basically all those liberal things, anti-Brexit, anti-Trump, and then you think that everyone think the same way, but actually it's not. Another problem is because fake news is more appeal to your emotion, because they're more eye-catching, and also rumors spread faster and easier. Because they're more eye-catching. They say, oh, that's interesting. Let me retweet, repost, share. like I say, for example, like a Facebook, they according to their numbers, so just in this year, the second quarter, April, May, and June, they have removed 7 million posts sharing false information about coronavirus, just in 3 months. And then what to do? What can we do? Say, I'm sure there's like still social media giants, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they all committed. They said we're going to tackle this problem. Yeah, for example, like Twitter and Facebook, they removed Donald Trump's post over the false claim about, say, children and coronavirus, because Donald Trump saying that children, they won't contract this, they're safe, but actually it's false, so they remove it. And then, yeah, for journalists, because we are gatekeepers, so I think we have the obligation to verify news. So basically, fake news should be stopped from us. Yeah, so we check it, we verify it. But the problem is very time consuming to verify, especially these days we have so many, we call user-generated content, UGC videos. Yeah, okay. The public submit things and we try to reuse and need to verify. It's a very time consuming. So many of those established news media, like the BBC, they have a BBC reality check, so the Guardian, Washington Post, New York Times, they all have like a dedicated team for fact checking. But the problem is the fact checking is very time consuming. And
probably even resources needed, money needed to do that, right? If you have teams to do that.
Yeah, you need a team. And then just imagine, so like a Facebook, they remove 7 million posts in 3 months. When you do fact checking, how many can you check? Yeah. And also, it's far less effective to contain the damage than fake news. Fake news, 7 million posts. How many of them have been like a repost? 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 16, and then but how many can you like fact check? And actually, who cares about fact check? Who going to the BBC reality check website to see what the news are being like debunked? Right? Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah, and also, so like Asad mentioned earlier, so government fact check, that's very problematic. When the government fact check, it's like a big brother, right? Yeah. So Donald Trump, do you expect White House fact check Donald Trump? Of course not. Yeah, another issue related to fact checking is that who check the fact checkers? Because if you go to like a fact check, you just Google fact check, there's so many fact checking like websites, all claim to be true, genuine, authentic. But some of them might be disguised as like a left-wing fact checkers, right-wing fact checkers. Just like a criminal dressed up like a police. Say, I'm police. Can you trust it? How can you find out? Give me your ID, you can't. Right? So there's basically to make the situation even worse, like a muddle and the water. So the fact check is important, but then the problem, who check the fact checkers?
Who are the fact checkers? That's something that's the tricky question here, and that's why we are having this conversation. And also the fact that throughout this conversation, we've mentioned so many social networking sites, which means that somehow this conversation is happening more now because of the fast resharing and sharing of information. It has led to a lot of fake news spreading very fast before it can even be fact checked. So Lauren, my question to you is that do you think that self-regulation by social media companies can play a better role in combating fake news? And are there some examples that you can give where some companies or organizations are doing it? Because we're now very sure that, just the big, the government's doing it or the big brother doing it is something that we don't really want when it comes to fake news.
Yeah, this is a really tricky question to answer. And I don't think that there is a perfect model that we can turn to. We do know that in the United States and in many other countries that more people are getting their news via social media than ever before, so than any other outlet. In the US, it's 4 in 10, so about 43% of people turn first to Facebook or Twitter as their primary source of news before they go to newspapers, either print or online. So in a time when more people are turning to social media, we really do face an uphill battle. This is also complicated by laws in the United States in particular that I'll speak to in this context, but I'd be curious to find out how it works in other contexts that treat social media companies not as media producers, not as publishers, but they treat them as neutral platforms, as a kind of apolitical digital public sphere where people come to gather and exchange ideas. So social media companies here are actually protected under a finicky section of US law, which is quite complex. It's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And this law came into being at the dawn of Web 2.0. So just as blogs were starting to become more popular, and when social media was still very much in its nascent stage, lawmakers rightly recognized the growing online area, the area for online discussion, and they did not want to suppress speech in these spaces. So social media platforms were allowed to self-regulate when it came to the content that exists on their platform. They do this through community standards, which I'm sure we've all agreed to, these community standards every time we get on these platforms. Though now we know through a lot of really excellent research that these standards aren't applied equally, and they don't affect all people and all groups in the same way, and they often harm minority groups. So instead of being these apolitical, neutral platforms, they are actually highly political when it comes to treating speech online. So in terms of coordinated campaigns of viral deception, social media companies now are facing a real challenge, and many of them are coming up with their own solutions. So not just modifying their community standards or, adding more people to their community moderation practices, but they're also turning to artificial intelligence and they're to discern, different patterns of virality. And they're increasing their workforce of fact checkers, but it also begs the question of like who checks the fact checkers? And Facebook and Twitter in particular have and recently announced new circuit breakers, which are a feature which is kind of like a tripwire, where when content becomes viral very quickly, they then have a team of fact checkers to identify what's going on with that content, to take it down if it needs to be. There's other technological solutions like browser extensions. I know of one called NewsGuard, which offers a kind of nutritional label with a simple green or red flag, depending on if it comes from a reliable source. However, again, these technical tools are not apolitical. So partisan news outlets like Fox News are given the green light, whereas other outlets such as the Palmer Report, which is a liberal American political opinion blog, are red flagged. So I don't personally have a whole lot of faith in the technological solutions to coming up with a technological solution to a social problem, and nor that social media companies are, with their profit motives, will do enough to stop disinformation. It would be antithetical to their advertising business model, which favors viral content. So we really need to think about how we can disincentivize these industries that profit off of disinformation. So we need more regulation. I don't know exactly what that looks like. I'm not an advocate to repeal Section 230 because I think it could suppress speech in ways that we wouldn't want. But yeah, it's an open question right now.
Yeah, it is an open question. And I'm glad that you also mentioned some mainstream media institutions, because a lot of people put the entire blame on, social media outlets, but there is more to it. And that's my question to Asad now, because we have talked about our side where there is rampant, but there is also rampant disinformation on political and other issues, which governments and regulators want to keep a check on. And do you think that social media platforms are responsible solely for this, or some mainstream institutions are also part of this fake news, and trying to mainstream institutions doing it, especially in relation to Pakistan? If you have something to say about that, Asad.
Yes, but before I answer your question very quickly, there is a standing joke we have here in our office that there used to be a traditional Big Brother. Let's say 20 years ago, there was the traditional Big Brother, and now the Big Brother has an evil twin, and it's called the corporate twin. And that these are the corporate platforms, by the way, and these may have just crossed the evilness of the traditional Big Brother. So,
and the twins also have cousins also, so they've
exactly. So that's that. And the idea of fact checkers working for institutions and companies like Facebook bothers me. It really bothers me a lot, frankly speaking. And like Lauren said, there are numerous studies which very clearly put out in in the daylight that the more viral content there is, the more activity there is, the more profit there is for companies like Facebook. That's what the hate for profit campaign is all about. There have been numerous studies in which there was a very clear finding that the activity on misinformation, disinformation activity on Facebook in 2016 US election uh, surpassed the real activity or the activity on the other sort of content. And so clearly it was or in very simple words, fake news, quote unquote, was very profitable for Facebook in that particular year. So yeah, I'm extremely skeptical of any solutions that Facebook or other corporates may come up with. And I'm specifically talking about the corporates which have their business models in a way that they profit from the hate, they profit from disinformation. Now, having said that,
sorry, Asad, but they do have like there is an oversight board now for content and these. So do you think these things will help?
So first off, Gulalai, the oversight board, as far as I know, is not operational yet. Right. So obviously, it will have some impact, but we'll only find out when it gets operational, when it becomes operational, and when it takes action and so on. As far as I know, it hasn't become operational yet, so we cannot comment on that. But having said so, we cannot obviously absolve the mainstream media of profiting from that disinformation and misinformation as well. And yes, we have seen many cases in Pakistan and India where fake news items or misinformation items were picked up from social media platforms, in many cases unintentionally, but picked up nonetheless and broadcasted and printed, and basically the mainstream media had a field day with that misinformation. And when they found out that this content was false, they never bothered to air an apology or even a statement saying that this content. So the harm basically was done. And yes, so the mainstream media is profiting from it as well. And so this again begs the question that what are those editorial standards that we boast of? In news and journalism, we always talk about editorial standards, right? That's what separates us from, let's say, a misinformation website or a blog and so on. And that's what matters in terms of the trust of the people, right? So the people trust journalism institutes because they have the standards, right? So my question is now, if we are on one side boasting about the standards, and the same standards fail to filter misinformation when it comes to printing them or publishing them and broadcasting them on the air, then do we really have any hope when we say the fact checkers will be these media institutions and so on? Frankly speaking, again, this is an approach that at least in Pakistan I would see with a certain skepticism as well. So to answer your question, yes, the mainstream media is also profiteering from the misinformation, and in many ways they're doing even more damage on the ground in terms of local context, because in these channels and these outlets we are talking about, they're almost always in the regional languages, in Urdu, for instance, or in Pashto and Sindhi, right? And so they do a lot more damage when they pick up political misinformation from platforms and they run it without a check.
Yes. Thank you, Asad, for pointing this out. I'm seeing comments from most of the people who are watching us, and they say that probably the reason even mainstream media institutions are doing this now is because fake news is what sells now. And that's really sad, because if this is selling, then as we said, that the corporate organizations are going to use it to sell their product or whatever they have to sell. Ping, before we go into what real harms can, misinformation and fake news bring to us, because that's something that I know that you really, really want to talk about, and you've been working on this also. We also saw, we saw COVID, and we saw that it was a pandemic that swept the entire world. And it also gave birth to this term, which was known as infodemic. So how did governments, apart from responding to the health challenges, were trying to, respond to fake news challenges about COVID? Do you have any examples from around the world how governments were able to respond, and how harmful fake news regarding COVID has been to this whole pandemic?
Yeah, I think just earlier we talked about, say, how fake news is bad enough under Donald Trump. So the COVID-19, it's just to make it worse, further worse. And then let me just quote the World Health Organization Director General, what he says. He said, say, quote, "We are not just fighting an epidemic, we are fighting an infodemic. So fake news spreads faster and more easily than this virus, and is just as dangerous." Yes, I'm sure that our audience, yeah, so in the past few months, at some point we came across some fake news about the virus, like false cures, faulty prevention methods. They have gone viral, and those are digital outbreak of disinformation is global. And those are like those involved, including states, world leaders, politicians, commercial companies, and individuals. So one of the most infamous example is at the beginning they said 5G spread the virus, right? Or they said like
yes, this is
outbreak.
something that's really big in the
5G,
UK.
those wireless things that spread the virus. Or the outbreak actually was a cover up for the 5G related illness. And of course, most of you, I think the audience here, they will say that's ridiculous, but still people believe it. And there's still many people believe that COVID-19 is a hoax. Literally yesterday, Saturday in London, there were protests in Trafalgar Square. They're holding the plaque, they say, yeah, COVID-19 is a hoax. Still people believe it. Yeah, so before I go down to how the government tackle it, there are many other, like I say, example incidents across the world. So for example, in Punjab, India, there's a rumors claim that the virus is a hoax, and the people, if you go there to have a check, so if you do not have a virus, they will send you to care center and you're being killed for your organs. And then of course, like Donald Trump, yeah, so in April, he was making a joke that, so like I say, suggesting in injecting disinfectants, you can treat coronavirus.
Yeah, that was the worst.
Yeah, and
that
then
could have happened.
in
From
London,
such a big leader here.
Yes, and of course he later on, I was just making a joke, but people believed it. And then in London, there were suppliers selling bleach as a remedy for coronavirus. When the woman was challenged by BBC, and she said, yeah, I believe it. Donald Trump said you can help. And then, like I say, in one of the regional governor in Peru, Latin America, and he suggested that eating llama meat can help fight off coronavirus. And then politicians in Nigeria, in South Sudan, they've been wearing that, like I say, a IBE. It's called like a virus blockers. They said they will have those, like I say, will disinfect those airs around you to protect you. Those are many examples. And actually, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, based in Oxford, they found that most of those COVID-19 related misinformation, they're based on like a true information, and then add up instead of completely fabricated. And they also found that most of those misinformation are top down from politicians, celebrities, and influencers. So here we ask questions. So why is that? I probably don't have the time to discuss now, but I think everyone should think about why is that. And then not down to like what the government have been trying to do. So according to a scholar, Roxana Radu, yeah, so she summarized basically, yeah. So first is to criminalize those coronavirus and fake news. And then they might establish like a social units to combat disinformation. And the third way is to provide guidance to social media companies on taking down false content. And then many governments, they also introduce like countermeasures, for example, emergency legislations. But the problem is, I think as Lauren mentioned earlier, so some government might use these as an excuse to consolidate personal power or to control the media, undermine the press freedom. So that is a very worrying. And in the meantime, also there are some governments or politicians, they are not very responsible. For example, say in China, so they generally believe that the virus started from the wet market in Wuhan in central China because of wild animals. But in China, on the internet, they've been like spreading all sort of alternative facts, as I mentioned earlier, alternative facts. Basically, it's a conspiracy theory. So one of the most prominent conspiracy theories is so the virus was brought in by the US military athletes attending the World Military Games in Wuhan. So the US military personnel brought the virus to China. It's not from the animal market in China. Another conspiracy theory, say, like circulating on the Chinese internet, is it was a CIA creation to keep China down. And of course, we all say this ridiculous, rubbish, but yeah, conspiracy theory always have roots. And then once you cast doubt on people's mind, you say, oh, actually, yeah, there might be not necessarily from the wet market. I've heard some rumors. So that's very dangerous. Yeah, you cast out basically like a pure water. You put a drop of mud and then you stir. You never see through what is the truth. Yeah. And also there are some world leaders like the president of Belarus, Lukashenko. He once claimed that vodka and sauna could keep virus at bay. Dismiss it. And then of course you have the Brazilian president, Bolsonaro, and also Donald Trump. In the beginning, they downplay the seriousness of COVID-19. And then they themselves also spread the misinformation about coronavirus. And then what's the consequences? US and Brazil has the most COVID-19 related deaths in the world, number 1 and number 2. So those we see different actors, government, state leaders, company, individuals, and then some of them responsibly, some of them dishonest, some of them might for different political gain. So that is some very worrying actually.
Yeah, Ping, you pointed out towards this legitimate concerns of stakeholders to deal with the issue of fake news, and especially during the infodemic that we're now calling it. Asad, we have had our own set of conspiracy theories around COVID and fake news around COVID-19 in Pakistan, and it was very difficult for even the government to convince people that this is a virus that is really harmful, for quite a few months before they could take some action. But my question to Asad is that, do you think that COVID-related, dealing with COVID-related fake news has given more power to policymakers in ignoring the legitimate concerns of other stakeholders to deal with the issues of fake news? Like, for example, we saw a lot of journalists being, told off as, on most of their news were being told off as fake news. Do you think that's something that is harming the concerns of journalists and media houses in Pakistan?
I think that's a very important question, Gulalai. And yes, there is this trend that we have seen of what we call locally as weaponization of fake news, in which basically the term fake news, quote unquote, is used as a way or as a means to target individual journalists or media houses, mostly those which are critical of the government policies. And yes, you are absolutely right that the COVID-19 and the whole sort of the idea of infodemic and obviously misinformation during the whole pandemic has given certain amount of authority to the policymakers to sort of enforce their views upon the media and sort of other journalist groups, and kind of in the guise of that policy making, use it as a means of enforcing their own ideas and so on. But then there is a very interesting other angle to it as well, that we have seen that obviously there has been in Pakistan, like you rightly mentioned, there have been a lot of misinformation on COVID, but a substantial part of this misinformation is actually coming from the government spokesperson. And this I'm failing to understand as to how the government policies about misinformation being spread by the media outlets is going to affect that. So, for instance, there's one sort of a government representative who in the house of who is the parliament floor of the parliament said that eating locusts, because obviously there is a swarm of locusts in Pakistan.
That was really
so eating locusts can actually we've heard that eating locusts can cure, like Ping said about the llama meat. So yeah, a lot of this misinformation is actually coming from the government spokespersons themselves. So I don't know how these policies are in any way or manner going to be implemented on the government officials. So yes, like you said, in my view, we need to be very careful in, and this is, by the way, I'm saying this specifically for my friends in the Western countries, because when they generally favor regulations, the point about regulations in countries like Pakistan and India is that they're almost always politically abused, right? So yes, I've been hearing a lot of my friends in international institutions and so on calling about the responsibility of the government and specifically in terms of policy making. But the point that you rightly pointed out, that it might as well be used in a way to curb and in fact introduce many more regulations in the guise of COVID misinformation.
Yeah. Thank you, Asad. You actually pointed out towards a very important issue that sometimes when some national approaches, and when they get validation from abroad or from different countries, it makes them happen more quickly. And sometimes some of the legitimate concerns are ignored. Lauren, my question is similar to what Asad said, is that, do you think that because it's such a tricky terrain that just like the topic says, will a global approach to this be more helpful than national approaches, like different countries dealing with it in their own way? And I mean, also, is it even possible for one global approach for something like fake news?
Absolutely not. Totally believe that the idea of, and not, by the way, not just for misinformation, but for literally anything, the idea of the global best practices is basically a sham. That's my view. I mean, people can obviously disagree with it, but the idea of global best practice is a sham. And in my view, I think that there is no such thing as global best practices, because if for every local problem, every problem on ground, which is like a factor, let's say in a country like Pakistan or India or Bangladesh, there has to be a localized solution to it. And that is why, in my view, the technological solutions for curbing misinformation will be very limited, even if they are kind of, let's say if they're rolled out in a very organized manner. In even that sort of approach, they will be very limited. So yes, a completely localized approach, in my view, is perhaps the way forward for this infodemic, and more importantly, the media and information literacy on ground. Now that's extremely important. I feel that a lot of people in Pakistan don't like to talk about it because it's not sexy enough, right? Because it doesn't involve a tech-based solution or so on. It really involves getting your hands dirty in the ground and actually going to the people who matter and talking about their weaknesses in terms of understanding misinformation and comprehending and deconstructing it. So that perhaps is one of the very important things that we haven't tried in Pakistan yet. And this is one thing that I've been always been pushing to the governments as well, to the successor government as well. And unfortunately, I think there hasn't really been any focus on media and information literacy in Pakistan. One important point that I would like to raise is in my previous sort of question response to you, I mentioned media outlets in general. So there are some media outlets, obviously, which are doing excellent job in fact-checking news content, such as Dawn, for instance, or Geo, and there are various others. But the point is, there are very few. And when something spreads, when something spreads in Urdu or let's say another local language, a fact-checked version of that news in English might not really be that sort of effective in terms of the spread and people's reach. So yeah, it's never enough unless the government makes its priority on dealing with this infodemic on a priority, and by not policy making or curbing media and putting on more regulations for media, but by introducing media and information literacy initiatives on ground which actually matter.
Yeah, that's a very important thing, the media literacy initiatives. But Lauren, I would also want your opinion on this global approach versus national approaches, because in Pakistan, of course, we need to have localized solutions, and probably all over the world also. But is there a model that we can, not best practices, but a model that somebody can follow, or different countries can come together to work on?
Yeah, I actually agree wholeheartedly with Asad. I don't think that there is a global model necessarily. And if we look around the world, we can see various models being rolled out by different governments that deal with either fake news or they deal with social media regulation in a different way. And they have chilling effects on free speech, or they end up having adverse effects. So, I mean, just to reel off a couple of examples, Singapore has a fake news law that allows broad overreach for the government to police speech on platforms and encrypted messaging apps. In Vietnam, there is a new controversial cybersecurity law which requires platforms to retain data locally, and I believe that's the case in Pakistan as well with your recent Citizen Protection Act. In Russia, they've criminalized the spread of anti-Kremlin news. In Malaysia, they've adopted new fake news laws which are reported, which were reported as a way for the then Prime Minister to fend off criticisms. France has passed 2 anti-fake news laws. Germany has passed laws to rein in hate speech, but it has had the adverse effect of taking down too much content. So I won't keep going, but basically, as governments try to quell the effects, the adverse effects of networked virality, either fake news or hate speech, they're going to tread a precarious line between upholding civic rights of free speech and maintaining maintaining national sovereignty and protecting their democratic process. The policy responses, in my view, are going to be a reflection of the values of that society, or perhaps the health of their democracy. So where countries with overbroad fake news laws will be markers of flailing democracy. So I think, agreeing wholeheartedly again with Asad, beyond policy, I think we need to think about building a global coalition around media literacy. And we can look to the UK for a recent example. They have a counter-disinformation toolkit. The aim of the toolkit is to strengthen the institutions of democracy, to uphold the democratic values by ensuring the public and our media have the means to distinguish between true news and disinformation. So it's a public toolkit. It's a way for people to educate themselves on, the epidemic of disinformation. And it's not perfect. And there are some criticisms that it could potentially fall into the wrong hands. But I think that these kinds of media literacy tools are going to be our best way to counter these things.
So probably user literacy, and then how they behave responsibly towards is something that we should be looking at as a solution, not a complete solution, but almost something that we can look at. We are very short of time and we have questions that we need to answer, but Ping, this is a question I really want to ask you, because you work with young students in journalism and you teach them, and you interact with a lot of them from all over the world. Have you seen, because of this whole thing about fake news and journalists being discredited and media institutions being discredited, do you see that there's a shift of young people opting less for careers in journalism, and often because they're scared of all those allegations that will be put on them? And if yes, then do you think it's something harmful? Because, then when you have no watchdogs, no journalists, no credible media institutions, then what do you do?
Yeah, because I teach undergrad and postgrad students and also give talks to high school kids. And one common thing is so I ask them, so what is the main source for you to learn news? Guess what? Social media, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat. So that is boring. And I ask them, do you believe whatever you've seen on social media? They say no. So that's a problem, right? You rely on social media and you don't trust social media. So that is the problem. And then also these days, some younger generation, the attention span is so short, like 10 seconds video clips on TikTok, that's good. No for, like I say, for those in-depth investigative journalism or story behind the story. So this is quite worrying. And I think it's not unique here, like Lauren mentioned earlier, in the States, people rely on social media. Yeah, so this is the things that we need to think about. Yeah, so when we do not, so for the younger generation, the inspiration no longer say, I want to work for CNN, work for the BBC, work for New York Times, but there's so many other alternative, options, online, apps. So that was make the professional journalism is in trouble. Yes. And then, skip this part. So what we can do, I think the most important is to educate the general public from primary school. What I say is you need to say to teach them how to tackle the media literacy. You can not only rely on journalism, professional journalists to stop fake news.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you said this, because that age of believing everything that came on TV or on the media is over now, and every person is responsible for fact checking. So there's some questions from people who've been watching us. And one is from Ashur, who says that there is this phenomena where the more facts you throw at someone which clashes with their worldview, the deeper they would dig into that view. So, people become very resilient about their point of view. So how to handle this phenomenon? We've seen this happen in during COVID. So if somebody wants to answer that.
I'll have a quick answer to that, but if anyone wants to elaborate. So in the communications research world, we kind of believe that to displace a conspiracy theory, you need a greater conspiracy theory. So it needs to be, this is a conspiracy about that, these people are wanting you to believe all of these things are connected, because you're absolutely right. The more that you make these connections, the more people will dig in. So I don't know if that's true. I'd love to see some research to prove that, but that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and there's this question about, can anybody help me about the media hybrid war theory? What's that, and how do we understand it? Ping, if you would want to, or somebody.
I'm not an expert in this, but this is, like I say, relatively very new term. I'm really, yeah, so this is very good, yeah, to raise this question, because basically I think that this is from the hybrid war theory, and then you apply this to media, and it's very recent. I just did some a Google search, found it's just in the past few months, especially now we have the protest in Belarus. I think this is a bit more research how to apply this basically war theory into the media landscape. Which is I want to give you fake news now.
This is a very interesting question that has come up because everybody talks about the economic opportunities that technology offers. So there's this question from Mr. Osman, who says that, is there any data available on losses due to fake news and a comparative assessment done on externalities this creates versus the economic opportunity created through social media? So, I think this is a very, again, from the economic point of view. So if somebody wants to answer this. I don't think there is data for.
I don't think there's such data available, but there have been some journalistic work in covering how opportunities, massive opportunities, by the way, came for young people. Let's say in small European countries, East European countries, during 2016, when they were generating content for Trump. And in favor of Trump, obviously fake news content in favor of Trump. And they were literally, because of the traffic and so on, they were literally getting hundreds of thousands of dollars in a year. And they were, this very interesting documentary I remember watching on Al Jazeera. In the comments, by the way, I'll post the link. And it shows how literally youth from this place, they became proper millionaires in a couple of months, and they bought cars, and their lifestyle changed and so on. So in terms of opportunities, that obviously is one thing. But to answer your question, I don't think there is there is like formal data available on such a thing.
And that's something. Lauren.
Sorry, I'll just add. I don't know of any data, but I do know that the disinformation economy is like a cottage economy. It's been growing. There's a whole infrastructure of disinformation. You can even buy likes or promote posts, I think even from vending machines in Russia. It's cheap. You can buy hacked accounts. There is just a whole infrastructure behind this.
That's something.
And I'm sure there will be very localized opportunities as well. So not sure if a global collection of data in this way is possible in any way or manner, but there are click farms in Bangladesh, for instance. There are troll farms everywhere across India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on. So most obviously they're economically motivated, and they're obviously generating a certain amount of revenue from all of this.
Ping, you had something to say on this?
In addition to those, commercial, a commercial background, they also, we also can consider some state-backed actions. For example, in Russia, the cyber army based in St. Petersburg. In China, the cyber army based in Shanghai. They are a state-backed. Of course, Kremlin Beijing won't say this is ours, but generally believe they're a cyber army. They spread misinformation and disinformation, and those you won't see the budget. They won't publish the budget on Google. This is also need to considered as well.
So I wish we had more time, because this conversation was really important, and I don't think we are still finished with it, because there's so many different aspects that are still left, probably some other time. But thank you so much, Ping, Lauren, Asad, for taking out time for this really important conversation. We might not have reached a conclusion because it's such a tricky terrain. But the one thing that we've all agreed on is that probably a global cooperation and collaboration on media literacy might help. So as users, the more responsible you are, the more aware you are, that's something that we all can work together on to combat fake news. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope we see each other again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.